It wasn't until 1997 that I met Kravstov again. Now, our meeting wasn't exactly deliberate, but I had the feeling that it wasn't accidental either. At the time, most of the secret work I used to do in the 80s and the early 90s had concluded. The agencies had all been dissolved along with the Soviet Union, and so there was very little secret work available on this side of the Atlantic. I worked in various institutions over the years, most of them run by the NHS. I did some studies on patients in Broadmoor for just under a year. Now, contrary to beliefs, Broadmoor is not a prison. It's actually a high-security hospital. The only difference between it and any other NHS hospitals was the absence of patients' right to refuse treatment. Now, don't get me wrong. I never conducted evil, twisted experiments like you see in House on Haunted Hill or the horrors of Dr. Mengele in 1940s Germany. All of my experiments were psychologically based and intended to help patients regain as much of a normal life as they possibly could have. Officially, they could not refuse treatment, but I always gave my patients the chance to opt out whenever they felt like it. I was at a psychology convention in West London. It was on for a few days, so I was staying at a hotel near Stonebridge Park. You'll have to forgive me for not remembering the name of the place. Now, it was almost 20 years ago. I was there in a bar attached to the conference center one evening, talking to professors from other universities when I heard him. "Comrade, over here!" It was Kravstov. What was he doing here? An ex-Soviet military commander at a British medical convention? I excused myself from my group I was talking to. Now they exchanged some strange looks with each other when I seemed to respond to the calling of comrade. After all, I had never discussed what happened 7 years earlier with anybody. I walked over to Kravstov. He was holding a brandy glass in one hand and had the smoking stub of a thick cigar in the other. He was dressed differently to the last time I saw him. He certainly looked more civilian now. He no longer wore the dark green blazer adorned with multiple military medals on his chest. "Kravstov, what are you doing here?" He had a surprised smile on his face.
Well, I'm not here for your psychological diagnosis, if that's what you mean.
I was surprised at how human he seemed compared to the last time we met. I can only presume the collapse of the USSR had lightened his mental workload. We sat down at a table on a less crowded side of the bar. "So, like I said, what are you doing here?" I asked him again.
Well, I contacted your university, but they said you were no longer teaching there. So I made a few phone calls, greased a few wheels, and I found out that you were going to be here for the next couple of days.
It seemed like he'd certainly made an effort to find me. My presumptions that our meeting this evening was no accident was indeed confirmed. "So, what are you doing here now?" I asked him.
Well, when Mother Russia began to fall apart, I did what any smart man would in this situation. I took advantage.
He chuckled as he took another sip of his brandy. He could see the inquisitive look on my face, and he put down his brandy glass on the table, leaned forward and continued to tell me.
Well, let's just say there were some countries in East Europe, but West Russia were able to get discount on surplus military hardware.
He winked as he relit his extinguished cigar.
I was responsible for liquidating assets, mostly military hardware. Tanks, aircrafts, trucks, weapons, ammunition. You get the picture. So, my instructions were simple. Sell what you have for the best price you can get and forward the money directly to Moscow.
It made sense to me. After all, what would the largest communist state want to do with hundreds of thousands of vehicles and hundreds of millions of rounds of ammunition when it's in the process of falling apart internally? "I think I can guess what happened next," I told him.
Perhaps, but there's no harm in telling you anyway. So, leaders from all over Eastern Europe and the ballistics could now buy the best military hardware in the world for a fraction of what it would cost them to manufacture. But there was a problem. How to transfer payment? Bank ask too many questions, even in Russia.
Kraftov took another sip of brandy.
I told them straight. I would only accept payment in gold bullion or US dollar bills. No compromise. The rest was simple. Paperwork was forged, amounts changed. 100 tanks for $300,000 could so easily be changed to 700 tanks on the paperwork after sale was complete. I suddenly had another 600 tanks at my disposal, which I could sell and keep the proceeds to myself.
Weren't you afraid of being caught? I asked instinctively. Kraftov chuckled.
Please, comrade, this was the fall of the Soviet Union, the biggest military power the world had ever seen. Yes, there were those who were supposed to keep check on things, but there was nothing an envelope of $100 bills couldn't fix.
He flicked his hand at me, summoning me closer to listen to what he was about to say.
Those who knew didn't care, and those that cared didn't know.
We talked about politics and the fall of communism for a couple of hours before we ended up on the topic of the failed lunar mission in 1990. Suddenly, the jolly mood darkened despite the quantities of alcohol we had consumed.
Comrade, if we are to discuss this topic, maybe continue this conversation in private.
I had to agree with him. It may have been the late 90s, but talking about top secret space launches in public places would have raised a lot more eyebrows than the sight of two men going to the same hotel room. So, we left the bar and we went back to my hotel room, which was a few minutes walk from the conference center. When we got back to my room, he sat in a chair next to the television. I pulled the other chair from across the room and we sat opposite each other as we resumed our conversation from the bar. So, what became of this mission? I asked him.
I couldn't tell you everything we knew back then, comrade,
he said with frustration.
We should never have sent a mission up there. It felt wrong from the start, but how could you stop it? It was just a cog in the giant communist machine.
I could understand his inability to prevent it. He certainly had remorse of it.
After the mission in 68 failed, we made contact with what was behind the decimation of those two missions.
My ears pricked up. I wasn't expecting him to say that.
We had an open line of communication between the launch site of the Kesha and them. Not the fighters, they were just the soldiers. No, this was much more real.
So, what were they? I asked him.
We don't know. They didn't understand our questions, but they communicated by the one true universal language: science. They had developed technology which was inconceivable to us at the time. Now, I do not know how much you know about technology, comrade, but I will break it down to simple terms for you. Before we made contact, we had little success in developing semiconductors. We sent them samples and plans, explaining our problems with simple symbols, and they returned the solution.
Sent? How did you send it? I asked. It's not as if they had sufficient radio bandwidth to send images to the moon and back.
Probes. We sent many probes to the moon. Inside were samples of our failed semiconductors made of germanium.
He continued as he walked over to the minibar and helped himself to another drink.
They returned probes with the solution. They suggested replacing the germanium with silicon. Also included were tiny quantities of chemical solutions, which they suggested we to use to aid the photolithographical process. These were much more reliable than the stuff we used here. Unbelievable stuff. We analyzed these samples and produced larger quantities of them. The process now works flawlessly.
I was amazed. I didn't quite understand all what he was saying, but I understood the general idea of it. Whatever was up there was helping the Soviets to develop higher technology.
But, Kraftov continued, we knew we weren't the only ones being helped. Over the next few years, we had agents in the United States who provided us with samples of American semiconductors. The process was identical to the one provided to us by them. This was no coincidence.
America had contact with them too? I asked him in no uncertain terms.
Of course, but they used their technology to enrich their capitalist society, selling it to their general population in new concepts of gadgets and electronic computers. We, on the other hand, used it to enhance our society and military power.
It all started to fit together. The technological improvements over the past 50 years were extraordinary. Too extraordinary for humans to complete unassisted. So, if they helped you to advance your semiconductor industry, why were they so hostile? He sat back down as he answered.
Comrade, you must remember one thing. They are not afraid of us. They don't have the ability to feel fear. All they do understand how to use it against us. They, too, however, have self-preservation instinct, as do all intelligent forms of life.
I had to ask the question, even if I didn't want to hear the answer. So, what did they want in exchange for this knowledge and scientific assistance? Krastov leaned back into his chair and he tried to think of a way to word his answer.
Как это слово? Well, they wanted to conduct experiments on human mind. Don't assume they were asking for permission. They didn't need any permission. They could do what the hell they wanted. No, what they wanted was our cooperation in allowing their experiments to work among the rest of society and to minimize our interference.
A chill ran down my spine as I asked him what sort of experiment they wanted to conduct.
Psychological experiments, of course. They wanted to see the reaction of general population when a smaller number of us are altered and allowed to remain physically unchanged.
Kraftov started to look uncomfortable as he talked about the subject. He started pacing around the room as he talked.
Let me ask you something, comrade. Do you believe in God?
I hesitated before I answered honestly. No, I'm an agnostic. I'm open to the concept of organized religion, but I'm not entirely convinced by it. He pointed to me as he chuckled quietly.
That, comrade, was a good answer.
I felt slightly uncomfortable by this time. What does my faith, or lack thereof, have to do with extraterrestrial assistance in Soviet technology? Go on. What's it got to do with religion?
Well, they have already conducted experiments before which were hugely successful for them. They altered the psyche of few people around our planet over the space of several centuries. People called them prophets.
Suddenly my mouth went dry and I started to sweat. Tell me you're joking, Kraftov. He lowered his tone of voice.
This is no joke, comrade. I'm serious. I was brought up as a Catholic myself, and I've grown to accept the fact.
I still wasn't sure whether or not to believe him. I don't think he was lying to me, but he may have been mistaken or interpreted it incorrectly somehow. Okay, so for the sake of this conversation, let's assume that all the prophets... Kraftov interrupted me.
Most, comrade. Most prophets, but not all of them, were part of their experiment. We just simply don't know which ones.
I continued my question. Okay, so let's assume that most of the prophets were part of the experiment. What are they going to do now? I mean, it's not as if they can create another religion. We have already had new religions in the past few hundred years, and they mostly fail because people are too set in their ways to accept new belief systems into their lives. Kraftov confirmed what I believed was true.
You're right, but religion is an old experiment. They know it was successful. You can see the result for yourself. What they want now is to experiment with, how you could say, anti-prophets.
I didn't quite understand. I need to know more. What do you mean by anti-prophets? Krastov thought for a moment before he spoke.
We do not know. We don't think they started yet. At least that's what they've told us.
The concept of an unknown extraterrestrial race was horrifying. Krastov continued in his serious tone of voice.
All we know is that they won't begin to experiment until our home planet completes 2,000 rotations around the sun after the birth of one of the prophets.
It couldn't have been clearer if he had spelled out to me in foot-high letters on my hotel room wall. So, you mean that they plan to conduct a new experiment after the year 2000? Bearing in mind that in 1997 the concept of the new millennium was generally an exciting and invigorating thought, this gave it a much more sinister prospect.
I can only assume what they have planned, but if you want my opinion, they're going to turn small numbers of people against the rest of us, possibly using the previous experiment as framework. However, because of how widespread the last experiment was, and how many people can find comfort in it, it will be almost impossible to isolate and eliminate.
My mind was all over the place by now. I was trying to comprehend what Krastov knew. So, what will be the outcome? I asked, not expecting a direct answer. Krastov looked worried.
I don't know. I just think that we need to be aware that next time we are attacked, it will be by those of our own species. Not for land, money, or even freedom, but for false ideology, which was given by their ancestors several hundred years ago by the result of an experiment by extraterrestrial beings, for reasons we can't begin to understand.
At that point, the conversation drew to a close. But like all Russians, Krastov didn't want our meeting to end on a low note. We talked about topics closer to home for the next hour or so. Football, television, our families, and so on, before he saw my camera on the table and took an interest in it. At the time, I was a keen amateur photographer, so I took my camera to London with me, even though I stayed in my hotel room the whole time. He asked me to take a photo of him. I don't usually take photos of people. Landscapes and architecture were more my subject of choice. I still took a few photos of Krastov. We had another drink, and he left me. I remember him saying that he would like a copy of those photos next time we meet. I wish I'd kept the contact with him. Back in those days, it was impossible to maintain contact with international acquaintances. Obviously, there was no Facebook or Twitter, and you can't just try and speak to every Krastov you find in the telephone book. It's not quite as common as the English names Smith or Jones, but it's certainly not uncommon. Maybe it's more like the Russian equivalent to Wilson or Roberts. Well, sadly, I never saw Krastov again.